Good evening and welcome back to Empty Cloud Monastery. My name is Bhante Suddhāso, and this evening I'll be talking a bit about noble conversation, a very important topic in Buddhism, how to use speech correctly. So I'll start with paying homage to the Buddha, and then I'll say a few words on the topic. And then if there's any questions or comments, I can respond to those at the end. So please feel free to type in questions at any time, and I'll take them when I'm done with the body of the talk. So we'll start with paying homage to the Buddha. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Buddhang dhammang sanghang namasami. So, when talking about speech, the place where one commonly starts is with what we find in the 5 precepts. So the fourth of the 5 precepts is not to tell deliberate lies. And that's simply something to not do. And also when looking at the Noble Eightfold Path, we find 4 instructions on right speech, which are, again, all about what to not do. Specifically to not, again, tell lies, to not engage in divisive gossip, to not use harsh speech, and to not use useless speech. So these are all instructions about what not to do. But also in a number of places in the suttas, the Buddha gives some very useful advice about how to speak in a way that is beneficial, how to speak in a way that is in line with the Dhamma. So instead of the negative formulation of don't do this, don't do that, there's also a few places where the Buddha gives it in a positive form of guidelines for speaking correctly or usefully. So I'd like to talk a little bit about a couple examples of this from the suttas. One is, this is found in many places, but one place you can find it here is from Anguttara Nikaya, chapter 10, sutta number 176. And this is a discourse where the Buddha is giving the positive aspect of the Noble Eightfold Path. So with these 4 instructions on right speech, the Buddha gives the positive formulation, which I find quite helpful. And this appears in many places in the suttas. This is just one sutta where it appears. So here the Buddha is talking to Chunda, who's one of his disciples. And he says, what are the 4 ways in which speech is pure? And he says, here someone has given up telling lies. They refrain from telling lies. And whenever they're in a group of people, when they're asked, what do you know? Say what you know. Then if the person doesn't know, then they say, I don't know. And if they do know, then they say, I know. If they haven't seen something, then they say, I haven't seen it. If they have seen something, then they say, I've seen it. So in other words, this is someone who has a commitment to telling the truth, to not telling lies. And the Buddha says, iti ata hetuva para hetuva amisikin chika hetuva na sampajanamasa vasita hoti. So one does not speak a deliberate lie, whether for one's own sake or whether because of somebody else or to get any kind of wealth, any kind of material gain. So this is still, of course, being put in the negative form. So this is just reiterating more clearly the principle of not telling a deliberate lie. And I think it's important here that the Buddha does emphasize that it doesn't really matter what your motivation for lying is, whether it's for your own benefit or whether it's somebody else. who's motivating you to lie, or whether it's because it will get you a little bit of gain of some sort, regardless of what our motivation is, we always avoid telling lies. The second aspect that we find in the Eightfold Path is refraining from divisive gossip. Pisuna vacha is the Pali term. So here again, the Buddha reiterates that, saying one refrains from divisive gossip. So one doesn't tell over there what you've heard over here in order to divide people, nor do you tell over here what you've heard over there in order to divide people. But the Buddha says instead, one seeks to unite those who are divided. One seeks to support and aid those who are together. One delights in harmony. One approves of harmony. One appreciates harmony. And one uses speech in a way that creates harmony. So here we're finding, again, a positive formulation. So the Buddha starts with the negative form of saying, well, don't speak divisively. Don't spread stories around in a way that divides people. But then he goes on to say, we should actually be doing the opposite. We should be actively trying to heal divides between people. If we know that there's some kind of conflict or disagreement or dispute between people, we should be trying to find some way to help them resolve the problem, trying to find some way to get them back on good terms with each other. And when people are already in good terms, already communicating well with each other, treating each other kindly and so on, then we should be seeking ways to support them in continuing that, ways to help to maintain that kind, gentle, friendly connection between those people, ways to support the harmonious rapport between them. And so the Buddha says we should be using speech in ways that promote harmony, ways that help to keep people on good terms. So this is a general principle that we should always be considering. How can we use speech in a way that helps to unite people rather than divide people, and which supports whatever harmony is present? Then the third aspect from the Eightfold Path is refraining from harsh speech. So parusa vacha. So refraining from harsh speech is the negative form, but the positive form that the Buddha gives here is he says instead we should be using speech which is sweet, which is pleasant to the ear, which is lovable, which is heart-touching. Hadayangama literally means going to the heart, which is humane. Pali word is pori, which is related to the word purisa. So pori means humane. Bahujana kanta, bahujana manapa, which means pleasant and agreeable to most people. The Buddha says, tataruping vachang vasita hoti. This is the kind of speech that we should be using. So we should be making an active effort to speak in ways which are pleasant and agreeable, to speak in ways which are pleasing to the ear, which are lovable, which are touching the heart. So this also I find quite interesting, this phrase, hadayangama. So to speak in ways which go to the heart, which touch the heart. So also when we're connecting with somebody else through speech, are we actually making a genuine heart-to-heart contact, a genuine heart-to-heart connection? So the Buddha here seems to be encouraging us not to just have superficial conversation, but rather to try to actually establish a genuine heart-to-heart connection with other people. But the main point of this, again, is to speak in ways which are pleasant and humane, which are agreeable to others. And this does need to be tempered a bit with another discourse on this topic, the Abhaya Rajakumara Sutta, the discourse to Prince Abhaya, in which Prince Abhaya asked the Buddha, would you ever say something that was disagreeable to someone? And the Buddha says that it would depend upon the circumstances. And he says that he would never say anything harmful to someone. He would only speak for their benefit. But sometimes, in speaking for someone's benefit, it is necessary to say things that they don't want to hear or that they don't like to hear. So this is also the case, although we try to speak in ways that are pleasant and agreeable to others. Sometimes, in order to do what is beneficial, sometimes we need to do things which are not so likable to certain people. But as long as we're focused on doing our best to bring about benefit, then that's the most important factor here. But when possible, we try to speak in ways that are gentle, that are lovable, that are heart-touching and humane, and so on. And definitely we should not use harsh speech in a cruel way. So not using speech in a way which is callous or inconsiderate. But again, as much as possible, speaking in a way which is humane. Then the fourth aspect of right speech that we find here, sampapalapang pahaya. So this is abandoning useless speech. So sampapalapa means chattering, babbling, frivolous talk, useless talk. So just rambling on about silly things, pointless things, idle chatter, small talk. And so instead, the Buddha says we should speak kalavadi, we should speak at the right time, we should speak in a timely way. Bhutavada, we should speak what is true. Attavada, we should speak what is beneficial. Dhammavada, we should speak about the Dhamma. Vinayavada, we should speak about the principles of training, the principles of self-discipline, the moral principles of Buddhism. It's worth noting, by the way, that the word Vinaya, when found in the Sutta Pitaka, almost always has the more broad or general meaning of moral discipline, moral self-training, rather than the specific meaning of the monastic rules. So this is a bit of a side point, but it is important to note when you find the word Vinaya in the suttas, it's not normally talking about the Vinaya Pitaka in specific, but rather it's talking about, more generally speaking, the moral principles of Buddhism, which includes the moral principles for lay people as well. So again, one should speak at the right time, one should speak what is true, one should speak what is beneficial, one should speak about the Dhamma, one should speak about the moral principles, moral trainings. And the Buddha says, Nidanavating vachang vasita. And this term I find especially delightful. The term Nidanavating means worth treasuring. So the Buddha says we should speak words that are worth treasuring. And this reflection alone, I find, really nails down the point of this aspect of right speech, this refraining from useless speech, is instead we think, am I saying something worth treasuring? Am I saying the sort of thing that somebody is going to want to remember? The sort of thing that somebody is going to write on a piece of paper and post on the refrigerator? The sort of thing that somebody's going to write down in a quote book? Am I saying the sort of thing that somebody's going to want to hold in mind, like a treasure? And if the answer is no, then we should consider whether it's really worth saying it. Like, are we just filling the air with more plastic garbage? Or are we putting out treasures that other people will be delighted to receive? So speaking words that are worth treasuring. And further, he says we should speak words which are sapadesang, which means reasonable, rational, logical. So not, again, not speaking things that are irrational or silly or pointless, but rather speaking saying things that are reasonable. Paryantavating. So paryanta means, literally it means with a limit all around. So paryanta means a border, a limit, a restriction, a boundary. So paryantavating means to speak in a contained way. Paryantavating means contained. So also, again, considering how much do I actually need to speak? So when possible, it's always better to speak in a concise way. So if you can say in 10 words rather than 100, say it in 10 words. If you can say it in 100 words instead of 1,000, then say it in 100 words. So speaking in a concise way, not producing a bunch of extra unnecessary words. So it's interesting that this also is an aspect of right speech. Trying to speak in a concise way, a limited way, a way which is contained. And this also has the sense of being contained to the relevant subject matter. So not to be constantly wandering off topic whenever possible, trying to also keep contained in the topic at hand. This also helps to support clarity of speech, clarity of communication. And again, considering how we're actually using our words. How we use words has a tremendous impact on the mind. So this means that we should be extremely careful how we use words, especially when we're interested in meditation practice. How we use words will heavily impact our meditation practice. If we're using speech correctly, then our meditation will go more smoothly. If we're using speech incorrectly, then our meditation will be a lot more agitated and restless. It will be much more difficult to develop good concentration. And finally, the Buddha says to use words which are atta sanghita. So atta sanghita means connected with benefit, connected with the goal. So things which are related to the goal of awakening. So as much as possible, we want to speak in a way which is going to help people make progress towards awakening. So another thing to consider before speaking is this actually going to help anyone? And in particular, is it going to help them make progress towards what's most beneficial, which is full awakening? So this is one very useful list of 4, which is the 4 positive formulations of the 4 aspects of right speech. Another list, which I find very useful related to the topic of speech, is from, again, this appears a couple places in the suttas, but one place is also the Anguttara Nikaya, chapter 5, sutra number 167, the Chodana Sutta. And this one is particularly talking about guidelines for when one is going to criticize somebody else. So this is for those cases where we are going to say something which is not so pleasant or agreeable to the other person. So as I just mentioned, for the aspects of right speech, one of them is to avoid harsh speech and instead to try to speak in ways that are pleasant and agreeable. But there is this exception of when it's necessary in order to bring about benefit. Sometimes we need to speak in ways which are maybe not so pleasant and agreeable to others. Say things which maybe they're not going to be happy to hear. Such as offering constructive criticism to someone, or suggesting that someone change a harmful behavior pattern or something of that sort. And this is actually a major element of monastic life, is giving constructive criticism to each other. we call it admonishment, the practice of offering Dhamma advice to each other on how to improve each other's conduct. And so in the sutta, the Buddha says that there's 5 aspects of how to criticize another person correctly in accordance with Dhamma. And of course, this is specifically about criticizing, but these principles are also generally applicable when considering how to use speech. And so the 5 are kalena vakami no akalena. So I will speak at the right time, not at the wrong time. So this is always considering when is the right time to speak. Again, this always applies with speech, like to consider, is this really the appropriate time? Or is it better to wait for another time? If the person we're speaking to is in a really bad mood, or their dad just died, or they just had a terrible argument with someone, or they're sick, or they're really busy and in a hurry, or there's something else where you're like, okay, this actually isn't the right time. Then we wait for a better time. We look for an opportunity when the person is going to be receptive to what we're saying, or at least more receptive than how they are currently. The second aspect is bhutena vakami no abhutena. So similarly, to speak what is true, not what is untrue. So this goes as a general principle of right speech, of course, to only speak truth. But especially when we're criticizing somebody else, saying something that they don't want to hear, then we really want to be sure that we've got our facts straight. It's actually quite damaging if you go to admonish someone and it turns out that you're actually completely wrong. Then it will make it that much harder to have any kind of good connection with that person in the future. The third one, sanhena vakami no parasena. So this one means I will speak gently, not harshly. So the word sanha means soft and smooth. So I will speak in a way which is soft, smooth, and gentle, not in a way that is rough and harsh. So again, this is similar to the principle from the Noble Eightfold Path of not speaking harshly, but instead speaking in ways which are pleasant and agreeable, ways which are humane, sweet, heart-touching. So in the same way, even when we're criticizing somebody else, even then we want to try to do so in a way which is soft and kind and gentle. Then the fourth one, atta sanghitena vakami no anatta sanghitena, which again, similarly, it's speaking what is beneficial, not what is unbeneficial. What is connected with the goal, not what is unconnected with the goal. So again, especially when we're criticizing other people, we want to be especially careful that what we're saying is actually really beneficial, really helpful. Helpful not necessarily just in the sense of, I want to get this off my chest, but rather like, is this actually going to be of benefit to the other person? So we want to make this careful consideration. Again, this applies before any kind of speech, but especially when we're saying something which might be unpleasant for the other person to hear. And the fifth one, which again is extremely important, the Buddha says, metta citto vakami no dosantaro. So one should speak with a mind of metta. So when we should only, as much as possible actually, when we're speaking to other people, we should be deliberately cultivating a mind of metta, trying to fill the mind with benevolence and loving kindness before we speak, while we speak, after we speak. But the Buddha says in particular, no dosantaro. So dosantaro means with inner aversion. So whenever we see that there's any kind of aversion or negativity inside the mind, then we need to pay especially close attention to how we're using speech. Because often, even if we think what we're saying is reasonable and appropriate and the right time and true and beneficial and all that, even if we think that, if there's any kind of aversion inside the mind, then that will tend to bleed out into our speech. And we'll find ourselves speaking in at times which are maybe not really the best time, and maybe exaggerating things a little bit so it's not quite truthful anymore, and definitely speaking a little bit harsher in a little bit more of a rough and bitter way than is necessary, and saying things which maybe aren't really all that beneficial. So we really need to watch whenever there's any kind of aversion inside the mind. Then it's especially important during those times to control our speech. And in those times, it's actually often best to be silent and to take a few moments to tranquilize the mind and cultivate a mind of metta before we resume using words. So those are a few things from the suttas, which I've always found particularly helpful in approaching the topic of speech. So at this time, if there's any questions or comments related to the topic, I'd be happy to take questions and comments related to the topic. Things which are off topic can wait until Friday evening monk chat. So let's see. First off, hello to all the people who have checked in online. Hello to Vivian, John, Geeta, Sleep Doc, Karuna, Suzanne, Yankee, Leilani, Meredith, Louisa, Mary, John, Kumu, Kim, Wasabi-chan, Manol, Sud, Bhumika, Anatta Lee, Norma. Hello to all of you. And I see a couple questions here. We have a question from Sud. Sud says, to be friendly, oftentimes in lay life, we engage in small talk. Would this be not in accordance with noble conversation? And would this be a hindrance to developing a calm mind? Often, yes. Often engaging in small talk is in fact useless and obstructive. But sometimes a little bit of small talk is a way of practicing metta. So you see someone and you're like, oh, hello, how are you? How's the kids? Or how's your project going? Or what's new for you? And yeah, it's just useless small talk. That's true. But it's a way of showing metta for the other person. And so if you're saying those words, not out of any interest in making useless conversation, but you're saying them as a way of bringing up metta within yourself and expressing that metta to the other person, then it's a form of metta practice and it's okay. Still, the encouragement would be to try to limit useless small talk and ideally to, as quickly as possible, steer the conversation towards something meaningful, something profound, something heart-touching, something relevant, something connected with Dhamma, connected with goodness. If it just turns into like chattering about sports scores and cuisine for endless lengths of time, then yeah, of course, that's going to be disruptive to developing a calm mind. But a little bit of small talk coming from a place of metta, if done carefully and attentively, is not an obstacle to one's practice. Norma says, when I was a small child, it was told to my mother that I would be a public speaker. I made my living speaking. It is my challenge daily. I'm worse with groups. Any advice? Well, so this is apparently one of the most common problems in the entire human race, which is difficulty with public speaking. I mean, I've been doing it for so many years now that it's become normal to me. But I remember when I very first started giving Dhamma talks, I had a lot of nervousness and anxiety in the beginning. And actually what helped a lot was just focusing on the fact that I knew what I was talking about. And also that it wasn't about me. that when talking Dhamma, all I'm actually doing is just letting people see the Buddha's words. It's not about me, my opinions, my personality, my thoughts, my ideas, but rather it's just about trying to be a clear window through which other people can see the Dhamma. And that really helped to eliminate the nervousness, because it took the self-centeredness out of the picture entirely. Because it's not about me; it's just about the Buddha Dhamma. So then there's no need to be worried about me. So that really made a huge difference. And Sud says, in terms of harsh speech, oftentimes it's based on how it's perceived. For example, I may call something stupid, but though the intention may not be to be harsh, it may be perceived that way. Would it count as harsh speech despite not having an intention of harshness? So this is a relatively refined aspect of right speech. So first off, in the most simple answer is no. If your intention is not to be harsh, then it is not harsh speech. That would be the simplest answer. However, the more refined investigation here is to try to pay attention to how other people are receiving our words and try to adjust our mode of speaking to match the people that we're with. And this is much more subtle, refined, and difficult, especially when one is dealing with people from different backgrounds and especially different cultures. Something which is perceived as rude and harsh in one culture might be considered as perfectly normal and okay in another culture. And vice versa. Something which maybe is considered the proper level of gentleness and subtlety in another culture would be considered opaque and meaningless. So it's important also then to be sensitive to this, to the fact that the way speech is perceived can be different in different cultures. And even within the same culture, it can be perceived differently depending upon a person's perspective. So the most important thing is that we're trying to speak gently. We're trying to speak appropriately. And if we find out that a way of speaking that we did came across in the wrong way to another person, well, we can apologize and next time try to speak in a way that they'll perceive as more appropriate. So it's an ongoing process. But the most important thing is our intention to speak gently, and also our intention to refine and adjust the way that we speak, depending upon our audience. Tan Nick says, how to control my mouth when I'm angry? Don't talk. That's how. Sometimes you actually just need to leave the room. If you're like, uh-oh, I'm about to say bad things, then leave. Just leave the room. Or change the topic. But yeah, it's sometimes you just have to get out of the situation, go for a nice long walk in the freezing cold air, focus on your feet, practice mindfulness of the body. Once you've calmed down a bit, do some metta meditation. Remind yourself to do lots of metta meditation every day for the rest of your life. And then it will gradually get easier. And when you're angry at a particular person, then actually look for nice things you can do for them. That makes a big difference. And Tannik also says, modern people do not want to hear treasures, and they are averse when I talk about Dhamma. They get triggered and prefer to engage in frivolous speech. Yes, in fact, it's not a problem only of modern people. There's also many suttas which talk about exactly this same problem. There were also many people in the time of the Buddha who had exactly the same problem of not wanting to hear valuable things and being triggered when they hear Dhamma. So actually the truth is that the majority of people prefer to live meaningless, frivolous lives filled with meaningless, frivolous speech. That's the way of things. Most people are like that. But we don't have to be like that. Others will speak frivolously. We will not. It's actually a delightful discourse, the Saleka Sutta, where we find exactly this line. Others will use frivolous speech. We will not. And Meredith says, I dislike doing small talk, but at work people don't understand not engaging in it. As I mentioned earlier, it's sometimes it's actually the right thing to engage in a little bit of small talk just as a way of showing kindness to another person. It should be kept to a minimum so that it doesn't invade your own mind. But a little bit, sometimes it's actually the right thing to do. I find it interesting in the suttas. Often when someone who wasn't Buddhist would come to talk to the Buddha, it has this little cryptic phrase where it says, and then the Buddha engaged in the appropriate polite conversation with that person. And it doesn't actually tell us exactly what was said. It's just left in this vague thing, the appropriate polite conversation. But I imagine it's probably things like this of like, oh, how are you doing? How's the kids? What's going on at work? Like just sort of the polite things that you say to another person, which you don't really care and they also don't really care, but it's just a way of showing that you're there for each other. And it's a way of showing kindness for each other. And the words themselves aren't that important. They're just a vehicle to communicate kindness. So if you're using small talk in that way, then it's okay. Just make sure that you don't do very much of it because it will start to make your mind noisy, which will make your meditation practice more difficult. And Karuna says, I've noticed when I'm practicing number 3, pleasing to the ear, lovely, going to the heart, polite, likable, and agreeable to the people, there's also a subtle defiled motivation to make people like me. I've experimented with choosing silence instead, but not sure this is the best practice for eradicating this craving. Yes, so this is normal. So wanting others to like you, yeah, that's normal. Try to focus just on making the other person happy. Just on using speech in a way that makes them happy. And focus on the inherent wholesomeness and goodness of using speech in a way which is beneficial and supportive to other people. And that will tend to override the selfish motive. But also it's good to keep in mind that our Dhamma practice, for 99% of the time, our Dhamma practice is going to be tainted by some degree of self-centeredness. That's just unavoidable. Until one is very close to the end of the path, Dhamma practice is almost always a little bit tainted by self-centeredness. There's really no getting around it. So we accept that that's the nature of it. But that as long as we keep persisting, then that self-centeredness component will gradually weaken. And eventually, some fine day, a very long time in the future, it will evaporate entirely. But for the time being, we accept that this is just the nature of working with an unenlightened mind on the path to enlightenment, is that there will always be a little bit of the taint of self-centeredness in everything we do, including our Dhamma practice. And Norma says, today I want to be quiet now as an older version of myself. I managed to speak too much. I overcame nerves. Well, it's good that you overcame nerves. That's good. And now you can practice being silent. Yeah. It's actually a really good practice. Go on a nice long meditation retreat where you just don't talk to anybody for weeks at a time. You sit together, you chant together, you walk together, you work together, but you don't speak. It's actually really delightful. We're in a silent retreat here at the monastery now, and except for little bits like these Dhamma talks, it's silent all the time. It's really wonderful. And Meredith says, I work in the automotive field. Salty mouth is the norm. Not sure exactly what salty mouth means. Does that mean like harsh speech?
I think more like cussing and kind of like
profanity, things like that.
Yeah, kind of like
coarse.
Coarse. Coarse is a good.
Well, the thing though is that when that's just the language of a place, then that's just the language of the place, and you speak in that language. So when you're in France, you speak French. When you're in Spain, you speak Spanish. When you're in China, you speak Chinese. Like, you use the language of the place. And when you're in the automotive field, then apparently you use salty mouth. That's okay. The important thing is that your mind is pure. But if you notice, okay, here everybody uses this word to mean this thing, and they speak in this way to communicate that, well, then you do the same, because that's how you communicate. And in fact, if you try to force everybody else to change the way they're talking, you're just going to make them mad and fail at communicating as well. So if salty mouth is the norm, then I guess you speak salty mouth, but try to do so with a kind, gentle, and tranquil mind. Okay, so John says, how can we apply these standards to dealing with a stubborn person who won't deal with their issues, which are causing annoyance to other people? They're like a bundle of tension. I think John is a little bit annoyed with whoever this person is. So the reality is we cannot change other people. We cannot control other people. We cannot make decisions for them. We can only control ourselves, and that's already difficult enough. So it's actually good news that we can't control other people. I mean, that would be a nightmare if we had to control other people as well as ourselves. So you do the best you can, but you also practice equanimity. So yeah, sometimes you'll be in the presence of a stubborn person who won't deal with their issues, as you say. Well, then your practice then is to practice equanimity, tolerance, patience, and kindness, while accepting that you cannot force that person to change. When the time is right, when it's beneficial, you might see an opening to help that person recognize that their behavior is not the best. But until that time, you get to practice patience. Sud says, would speech that is noble automatically follow if the mind is absorbed in metta? Not necessarily. Because the mind absorbed in metta does not necessarily have wisdom and self-restraint. So you may still speak in useless ways. You may still speak in frivolous ways. You probably won't speak in harsh ways or divisive ways, but you might fall into useless speech. And also motivated by metta, if metta is combined with foolishness, we might also tell lies, thinking it's a good idea when it's actually not a good idea. So no, a mind of metta will help avoid some kinds of wrong speech, but not all. Still very important. Manish, this is a little bit off topic. Manish says, unable to focus on my own work, addicted to social media, how to get rid of this, please guide. It's a little off topic, but I'll tell you, there's a very simple solution. Delete all of your social media accounts. And I mean literally delete the account. Don't just delete the app from your phone. I mean literally delete the account itself. Delete all your social media accounts. It's great. Yeah, just cut it out of your life entirely, and you'll find your life gets dramatically better. And Anonymous says, when someone tells me that their dog or family member died, I usually say, oh. If I say, sorry to hear that, I feel like I'm lying, because I'm not sorry, because everything dies. So what do I say? Well, Anonymous, I say that your metta practice is weak, and you should focus on doing a lot of metta, because it sounds like you're a little bit lacking in the metta department of Buddhism. When somebody is grieving because they've just experienced a loss, then your practice is to be as kind, compassionate, and considerate as possible. So maybe you can't say, I'm sorry to hear that, but you could say something like, I'm sorry you're having a hard time. I'm sorry that you have to go through this difficult experience. What can I do to help? Don't just be like, oh, well, everything dies. That's not very kind. No, you want to say something kind. You want to look for ways to be supportive, ways to be helpful. So Karuna says, sometimes in a group setting, I'm conflicted between saying something that might be beneficial and being perceived as showing off, which is mortifying. Mostly in these situations, I choose silence instead. Is this the best practice in this situation? So it's highly circumstantial. So it's hard to make blanket statements about what the right choice is. So you need to evaluate for yourself. If you actually have something to say that might be beneficial, then maybe you say it. And if other people might perceive it as showing off, well, that's their problem, not yours. Your concern is whether or not you can do something that's beneficial. That's your concern. How can I use speech in a way that is beneficial? And sometimes other people will perceive that as showing off, and sometimes they won't. But that's their problem, their defilement, not yours. Now, if you look at your own mind and you're like, well, actually, I want to say this because I like showing off and I want other people to perceive me as competent or whatever, well, that's a bit more problematic. But if you actually are wanting to say something because you believe it will be beneficial, then you should say it anyway, regardless of whether or not people will think you're showing off. And let's face the facts, sometimes you're just competent and right and good. And other people might actually think more highly of you as a result of what you say. That's just facts. And it doesn't mean you're trying to show off. It just sometimes means you have something useful to say. And it looks like the last question. So I think we'll go ahead and conclude the session at this time. So we'll end now with 3 sadhus. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu. And we'll see you all next time.